Hey there, macro folks. This is Mr. Hooker, and this is going to be the first video on international trade. So let's get to it. So we're going to skip that one. So, international trade, if it's done well, and well, by well, we mean pretty much free trade, which hasn't happened since before World War One. I mean, since then, they shot that Archduke and everybody's had it out for somebody else because they didn't like the fact that they were friends with someone else. But the most globalization that has ever happened was pretty much the 40 years before 1910. So just go ahead, do that math. There you go. But since then, we have not been as globalized. It's always been that somebody's doing something to someone. And like right now, we've got a ton of tariffs. If you're following the news at all, you know that we're doing that. But um, if we were close to free trade, it is like discovering a new technology. And so we'll talk a bit about that in this class, um, in this lecture. But there we go. So this is basically that idea. So the idea of the everywhere phone, looking at iPhones, a number of you probably have one. The displays come from South Korea. They're assembled in China. The research and the design comes from the U.S., raw materials from all over the world. So even Texas Instruments sends some of the materials from Texas. So trade makes the world go round and therefore richer. So international trade, basically, it's more important for some countries than others. You've had a few countries, especially down in South America, who have decided, hey, we're not going to do this. But hyperglobalization has been the phenomenon of extremely high levels of international trade, and we just have done that kind of crazy. Um, so you can see here exports as a percentage of GDP in the blue percent, and then the orange is imports as a percentage of GDP. Now, when you say as a percentage of GDP, we are never going to be really high on that because we have such a very high GDP. Belgium does not have that great a GDP, and therefore, they're very high on that chart. So, as a percentage of their GDP, yeah, their exports and imports are really high. They're over 80%, but they have a really low GDP. So, yeah, you know, statistics can lie like that for you. So there's numbers, there's statistics, and there's damn statistics. So, it's kind of that way. Germany's there at about almost 50% on exports as a percentage of GDP. But once again, Germany's the size of New Jersey and New York. So there's a thing to that. And then these other countries there, Mexico, Canada, France, uh, China, Japan, same kind of thing with that. Comparative advantage in international trade. So from chapter two, you have comparative advantage of producing a good or service if the opportunity cost of producing it is lower than for your country than for other countries, or lower for one economic unit than another economic unit. You can make it for states, people, whatever. So Ricardian model, which is based on David Ricardo, of international trade, analyzes trade under the assumption, which makes production possibilities frontiers straight lines, um, which doesn't really happen. So straight line production possibilities curves means the goods are really interchangeable, and basically you have constant opportunity costs. In the real world, the goods typically aren't. You have the concave you have the concave production possibility curves because we have increasing opportunity cost. So there's not that piece. So autarky is where one country does not trade with other countries. Like I said, we've had that a couple of times in recent history down in South America. where countries decide, hey, we're going to get ourselves straight by just not trading. This tends to go horribly wrong because what happens is it costs you so much more to make certain things than you thought it would. Those things become terribly expensive. Your people get all upset because what used to be a $5 item becomes a $20 item, and now they're poorer because they have spent $20 on what should have been a $5 item. And so it just becomes a problem. And that's part of this problem of autarky. So we've got the US um, and China. The US could produce 100,000 trucks or 100 million phones. China could produce 50,000 trucks or 200 million phones. So there is that idea with that. The US would currently produce 50,000 trucks and 50 million phones. China would produce 25,000 trucks and 100 million phones. So that's US's consumption, China's consumption, in autarky without trade. So let's assume that we are going to trade. Um, so we have different opportunity costs. It makes sense to specialize in trade. So one of these things about uh, international trade, when you do something like this, you are going to come to terms of trade somewhere between the opportunity costs. So if the US concentrates on producing trucks, China concentrates on producing phones, because that's where the comparative advantage lies. It'd be possible for both countries to consume more of both goods. Um, so note that that is the U.S.'s consumption. In autarky, was 50,000 um, trucks, 50 million phones. And China was at 25,100. So with trade, the U.S. is just going to make 100,000 trucks, and China is just going to make 200 million phones. So we're going to trade. The U.S. is going to get 75 million phones and 62,500 trucks. China is going to get 37,500 trucks and 125 million phones. So as you can see, both of them are now outside of their production possibilities frontiers. And so that would cause a shift outward. And it is like I said, it's like discovering a new technology because any shift outward is like discovering a new resource or technology. In this case, it would be technology. So don't confuse absolute advantage and comparative advantage. Um, just because the U.S. can produce more of both goods doesn't mean we're better off without trade. That's actually false because China's producing more phones. So that's actually kind of false. They're producing 200 million phones. The U.S. is only producing 100 million. Pay attention to your opportunity costs. If it's cheaper for China to produce phones than it is for the U.S. would want to import phones from China. Bad example. All right. So productivity and wages around the world. The real explanation for how wages in poor countries is low. Uh, so global wage percent of the U.S. is a percent of the U.S. wage. Uh, so Mexico is a little less than 40% of it. Greece is a little over 60%. U.S. is 100%. Switzerland's near 100%. Iceland's about 80%. Italy's about 80%. Oh, wait a minute. Hold on. I'm reading off of productivity. So Mexico is about 20% of the wage. Latvia is about 45% of the wage. Greece is about 30% of the wage. Uh, U.S. is about 100%. Is 100%. Switzerland's a little over 100%. Iceland's about 120. UK is about 80%. Uh, so Switzerland's about 100% of the productivity, but a little over 100% of the wage. Iceland's at about 80% of the productivity, but about 120% of the wage. There's some others on there that are about 90% of the productivity and 110, 115% of the wage. So differences of climate. Bananas will grow better in certain climates. You need to be a tropical climate. Canada can produce paper more cheaply because it's heavily forested. Um, that's one of the reasons, like in the U.S., one of your largest paper producers is Georgia Pacific, because you ain't got a whole bunch of trees here in Iowa, but we got plenty down in South Carolina and Georgia. So Georgia Pacific is one of your largest paper producers. My father was a forester, and so he bought and sold timber for all of my life. I don't know what he did as a forester before we moved to South Carolina, but uh, every week at least three people drove up into our yard, unannounced, uninvited, trying to get him to buy timber from them. So it was just a thing that happened being a forester. I grew up in South Carolina down near Charleston, for those that don't know. Um, Factor abundance, supply of a factor of production relative to the other factors. How many forests does a country have compared to machines or people? And the intensity measure the quantity of a factor, how much labor is used compared with natural resources. So we are a very productive nation because we have highly trained labor. So country that has has an abundant supply of a factor of production has a comparative advantage in goods whose production is intensive in that factor. Greater endowment of forested land gives Canada a comparative advantage in forest products. So there's also differences in technology. Sometimes a country has developed a particular technology that explains its comparative advantage, like Swiss watches, for example. They have developed that technology and it gives them an advantage. There's also increasing returns to scale. So productivity rises with the quantity of output. So there's 8% more labor and 9% more raw materials increase output by 10%. That seems low, but that's about what it is. The raw materials piece, I mean, you're sucking up raw materials. It takes a good bit of labor, and you're only getting 10% out of it. So increasing returns to scale drive international trade. If an industry gets more efficient as it grows, there will be a few large producers, and then production takes place only in a few countries. Look at large jets, not just small planes, but massive jets like the 757s or 787s now. There's really only two places these things are made, in the US and in France. And in reality, there's really only two cities they're made. And I don't know where the city is in the US, and I don't really even know where the city is in France, but there's really only two cities where these very large jets are made. I think Seattle's where it is. It's in Washington, is where they're made here in the US. And then there's somewhere in France that Airbus makes them. So it's only Boeing and Airbus that makes them, and I think it's Seattle or just outside of Seattle. There it is. Seattle and Toulouse. That's it. As a result of increasing returns in large passenger aircraft. Um, so Hong Kong lost its comparative advantage in garments. Um, it got better at other stuff, but it lost that. So, so that meant it was now giving up more to produce garments. So Bangladesh picked it up. So there's that whole piece. Also, if you ever look at your tags, um, if you ever look at the tag for your garments, you'll see that a lot of stuff gets made in Honduras and Vietnam now too. So it's kind of interesting how all that works. All right. So US tends to have a comparative advantage in goods which require basically high skilled labor. We're going to stop right there. That's a great stopping point. We'll catch the rest in video number